The markets are back open today after a three-day weekend, but they are not off to a great start this week. The Dow down around 300 points today. MSNBC host David Gura is here now to talk through what's going on. And David, oil prices have been weighing on Wall Street. Yesterday, OPEC finalized a deal on a historic oil production cut. President Trump very pleased about it. Those cuts look like they helped oil prices today, but didn't really do anything for stocks. What happened there?
So we know what OPEC Plus has agreed to, and that is about a 10 million barrel cut every day. And the president got on Twitter today and said that's being misreported. There's actually activity that could lead to a 20 million barrel per day cut. That's the kind of cut that would make the market more rebalanced, and we're not there yet. But what he's done is a bit of fuzzy math here to make it seem like that could be possible. So investors are kind of confused about what's going to be the deal in the end. We saw some apprehension there from investors. Another thing is just earnings season is set to begin. Obviously, that cyclical happens every quarter.
Right.
There was some agitation as all of this got underway. Maybe it'd be wise to skip earnings because of how bad this has been, how dislocated so much has been over the course of these last few weeks. It's going to go ahead. So in these coming days, we're going to hear from a number of big banks, financial companies, big consumer staple companies as well. Investors doing what they would do under any normal circumstances, just waiting to see the health of these companies and get another indication, Allison, of just how much the COVID-19 outbreak has weighed on companies that are on the exchanges.
Yeah, David, I have to imagine that some of these reports coming in, especially when you start talking about, I know the banks are reporting this week and several other industries, but you have to imagine some of these reports are going to start to reflect some of the stress of coronavirus.
Yeah, absolutely, and we've gotten indications of that from executives who have spoken ahead of the release of all of these reports, ahead of this data. But yes, we've been sort of watching that happen on the economic side. We're going to see that on the corporate side, the market side now going forward. I know that Duke has a big CFO survey they release every few weeks. We're going to get that this week as well, an indication of sort of sentiment that executives are feeling about the economy, about the particular sectors that they're in. So yes, we're just adding to our sense of data again in the market side, as we've seen in the economic side over these last few weeks.
David, I know individual Americans, also businesses, particularly small businesses, have been wondering when they might actually see stimulus checks or those small business loans hitting their bank accounts. We have an answer to at least one of those questions. I know the IRS tweeted that its first checks went out this weekend. If people haven't gotten their stimulus money yet, do we know when that money is coming? And do we have any updates on the small business front?
So we've got a sense here on those stimulus checks, those direct payments, that those that are going out by direct deposit have started going out this week. We're going to see more waves of that going forward. We have seen the federal government now establish a website where you can input your information. If you're not somebody who's filed in the past, need to get that information to the Treasury Department, to the IRS. It's people who are going to be getting those paper checks who are going to be waiting a long while. They're going to be in a later wave of this, and indications are from congressional committees this could take many weeks, up to a matter of months, for those checks to come through the mail. So obviously, that's going to be a huge disappointment for folks who really need those direct payments from the government. But yes, we do have a better sense of what the timetable is going to be like now. And the federal government, proud of the fact that at least those direct payments are starting to go out now and fairly quickly.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.